Hi, everyone. I'm Jack, and welcome to the show.
I'm Elena.
Today, we're talking about something I think a lot of you are going to find useful, using podcasts to help you learn English.
Yeah, a lot of people have trouble with listening, and podcasts can be a great way to practice.
I think that's true for everyone learning a new language, right? Like it's one thing to read and write, but then you hear someone speaking, and it's like a whole different thing.
Definitely. I mean, for most of us, the goal is to be able to actually talk to people, right? So
Hmm.
listening is so important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, okay, we want to use podcasts to improve our listening, but I mean, there's so many out there. How do we even know where to begin?
Well, that's what we're here for, right?
Yeah.
To help you guys navigate all of that, the first thing to think about is your level. Are you a beginner, intermediate, advanced?
You probably don't want to jump into like a super fast-paced podcast about like quantum physics if you're just starting out.
Right. It's going to be way too overwhelming, and you'll probably just end up feeling discouraged. So if you're a beginner, I would really recommend starting with podcasts specifically designed for English learners.
Okay, so those are podcasts that are kind of like built from the ground up to help people learn.
Exactly. They use simpler language, they usually speak a little bit slower, and they often talk about everyday topics, things that are relevant to your life.
So it's not just like listening to a lecture. It's actually stuff you could see yourself talking about with someone.
Yeah, exactly. And there are a lot of great podcasts out there for beginners. One that I often recommend is lessonaminute.com.
Okay, I've heard of that one. What's so special about it?
Well, the podcasts are only 1 minute long.
Oh, wow. That's pretty manageable.
Right. It's easy to fit into your day, even if you're really busy. And they have transcripts too, so you can read along if you need to.
That's cool. So, okay, I've been listening to those 1-minute podcasts for a while. I feel like I'm ready for something a bit more challenging. What's next?
So once you're comfortable with the beginner stuff, you can start exploring podcasts that are made for native speakers.
Okay, so those are just like regular podcasts that English speakers would listen to.
Exactly. But you don't have to jump straight into the deep end. There are still plenty of podcasts out there that are great for intermediate learners.
So what makes a podcast good for intermediate learners?
Well, they might use slightly more difficult vocabulary and the pace might be a little faster, but they're still going to be pretty clear and easy to follow.
So it's kind of like stepping up a level, but not like jumping into the ocean when you only know how to swim in a pool.
Exactly. And, there are a couple of really popular podcasts that I always recommend for this level. One is 6 Minute English from the BBC.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one. They have like all sorts of interesting topics, right?
Yeah, they cover all kinds of stuff, science, culture, news, you name it. And they're all around 6 minutes long. So again, pretty easy to fit into your day.
Okay, that's good to know. And is that one British English?
It is, yeah. So that brings up another important point, which is thinking about what kind of accent you want to learn.
Right, because there's a pretty big difference between British English, American English, Australian English.
Definitely. And the goal is to be able to understand and be understood by people, right? So it makes sense to focus on the accent that you're most likely to encounter or that you're most interested in.
So if someone wants to learn American English, do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, definitely VOA Learning English is a really good one.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one. What is it?
It's a service from the Voice of America, and they have a bunch of different podcasts on all sorts of topics.
That's cool. And they use American English?
They do, yep. So that's a good option if you're looking for an American accent. And they have transcripts too.
Okay, that's good to know.
Mhm.
So let's say I picked out a podcast that's at my level, it's got the accent I'm interested in, I'm ready to go. Am I all set? Like, is it enough to just listen?
Well, just listening is definitely a good start.
Mm-hmm.
But if you really want to see improvement, you need to be a little more active with your listening.
What do you mean by active listening?
So you know how sometimes you might have a podcast playing in the background while you're doing something else?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
Like I'll have one on while I'm cooking or cleaning or whatever.
Right. That's what we call passive listening. You're not really paying attention to the podcast. It's just kind of there in the background.
Yeah, and I feel like I don't really remember much of what I listen to when I do that.
Exactly. It's fine to do that sometimes, just to kind of get used to the sounds of English. But if you really want to improve, you need to actually focus on what you're hearing.
Okay, so what's the difference? Like, how do I do that?
Think of it this way. Passive listening is like going for a walk, you're getting some exercise, but it's not very intense. Active listening is like going for a run. You're really pushing yourself, and you're going to see better results.
Okay, I like that analogy. So active listening is like running for my ears.
Exactly. It's about really engaging with the podcast, trying to understand everything that's being said.
Okay, so how do I make sure I'm doing that? Like, what are some specific things I can do?
Well, there are a lot of different techniques we can talk about, but one of the most important is to try listening without a transcript first.
Wait, really? But I thought you said transcripts were helpful.
They can be, but only if you use them the right way. When you first start listening to a podcast, resist the temptation to look at the transcript.
Why? Isn't it helpful to see the words?
It can be, but you want to force your brain to work a little bit, Make it try to figure out what's being said just from the sounds.
Okay, so it's like I'm giving my brain a workout.
Exactly. And that's how you get stronger. The more you challenge yourself, the better you'll get at understanding spoken English.
Okay, that makes sense. So if I'm not using the transcript, how do I know if I'm understanding everything correctly?
Well, that's where the transcript comes in later. Once you've listened to the podcast a few times without the transcript and you've tried your best to understand it, then you can use the transcript to check your work.
Okay, so it's like a tool I can use to see how I did.
Exactly. You can see if you missed any words or phrases, and you can look up anything you don't understand.
So the key is to listen first, and then use the transcript to help me fill in the gaps.
Exactly. That's a much more effective way to use a transcript than just reading along while you listen.
Okay, that makes sense. What else can I do to be a more active listener?
Another really good tip is to take notes while you listen.
Okay, I actually do that sometimes when I'm listening to podcasts in my own language. Like
Wow.
if there's something I want to remember, I'll jot it down.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same idea with English. You can write down new words you hear or important points from the podcast or even just things you find interesting.
And I feel like the act of writing things down helps me remember them better anyway.
Definitely. It's a good way to stay engaged with the podcast and to make sure you're really processing what you're hearing.
Okay, so we've got listening without a transcript and taking notes. What other active listening techniques are there?
Have you ever heard of shadowing?
Shadowing. What's that?
It's basically where you listen to the podcast and repeat what the speaker is saying as they're saying it.
Oh, wow. So I'm like an echo.
Yeah, exactly. You're trying to mimic their pronunciation, their intonation, even their speed if you can.
I can see how that would be good for pronunciation.
It is, and it can also help with fluency, getting your mouth used to making the sounds of English.
So it's like a workout for my mouth muscles.
Exactly. And you can even record yourself shadowing and then listen back to it and compare it to the original podcast.
Oh, that's a good idea. Then I can really hear how close I am.
Exactly. It's a really great way to pinpoint areas where you need to work on your pronunciation.
Wow. There are so many things I can do to improve my listening. I had no idea.
And there's actually one more technique that's even more challenging. It's called transcribing.
Transcribing. Okay, I'm not sure what that means.
So basically, you listen to the podcast and you write down every single word that you hear.
Oh, wow. That sounds really hard.
It is. It's like the ultimate test for your listening skills.
Yeah, I don't think I'm ready for that yet.
It's definitely a more advanced technique, but it's something to work towards. As you get better at listening, you can start trying to transcribe small sections of podcasts and eventually maybe even whole episodes.
Okay, so it's like a long-term goal.
Exactly. But you don't have to jump into the deep end right away. Start with those other techniques we talked about, and then you can work your way up to transcribing.
Okay, that sounds like a plan. So, okay, I'm sold active listening is the way to go. But honestly, it all sounds like kind of a lot of work. Like,
Yeah.
how do I make myself actually do all of this?
Well, the key is to find a technique or a combination of techniques that works for you, and then to make it a regular habit.
So it's like going to the gym. You're not going to see results if you only go once.
Exactly. You need to make it part of your routine, whether it's listening to a podcast every day during your commute or setting aside some time each week to practice shadowing.
Okay, so consistency is key.
Got it.
Got it. But what if I run into problems? Like, what if I can't understand something or I get stuck?
Well, you don't have to do this alone, There are tons of online communities for people learning English with podcasts.
Really? That's
Yeah.
cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah, you can connect with other learners, you can share tips and advice, you can even practice speaking with each other.
So it's like having a study buddy,
Yeah.
but online.
Exactly. And sometimes it's just helpful to know that you're not the only one who's struggling,
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I'm actually starting to get excited about this now. Doesn't sound so intimidating anymore.
That's great. That's what we want. Learning English should be fun, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'm going to find some podcasts I'm interested in, and I'm going to start listening actively. I'm going
Got
to
it.
try out all these techniques. But before we wrap up, any last words of advice?
I think the most important thing is to remember that it's a journey, Don't get discouraged if you don't see results right away. Just keep practicing, keep experimenting with different techniques, and most importantly, have fun.
I love that advice. And on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this part of our conversation. about using podcasts to improve your English listening skills. But don't worry, we'll be back soon with even more tips and tricks. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. We're continuing our conversation about how to use podcasts to improve your English listening skills.
Right. Last time we talked about how important it is to find a podcast that's right for your level, and also about why active listening is so much more effective than just passive listening.
Yeah, and we started talking about some specific active listening techniques.
Yeah.
So I wanted to pick up on one of those techniques that you mentioned, which was listening without a transcript. And I gotta be honest, that one kind of surprised me. Like you said, transcripts can be helpful, but you said we should actually try to listen without them first.
Right. And I know that might seem counterintuitive, but there's a really good reason for it.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me why.
Well, think about it this way. When you're having a conversation with someone in real life, you don't have a transcript right. You have to understand what they're saying in real time, just based on what you hear.
Yeah, that's true. I never thought about it like that.
So listening to a podcast without a transcript is actually really good practice for those kinds of real-world situations.
Okay, so it's like I'm training my brain to understand spoken English without any visual cues.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it forces your brain to work harder. You have to really focus on the sounds, the pronunciation, the intonation, all of that.
So it's kind of like a workout for my ears.
Exactly. And just like any workout, the more you do it, the stronger you'll get.
Okay, that makes sense. So I'm going to try that. I'm going to resist the urge to look at the transcript. Okay, let's say I'm listening to a podcast without a transcript, and I come across a word I don't know, or maybe there's a whole section that just goes right over my head. What do I do then?
That's totally normal. You're not going to understand every single word, especially when you're first starting out. And that's where the transcript comes in. But the key is to use it as a tool, not as a crutch.
Okay, so I should just be reading along with the podcast the whole time.
Right. The idea is to listen first, try your best to understand it on your own, and then use the transcript afterwards to check your understanding.
Okay, so I can see what I missed or if I misinterpreted anything.
Exactly. And you can look up any words you don't know. That's a much better way to use a transcript than just relying on it from the beginning.
Okay, got it. So listen first, transcript later. That's my new motto.
I love it. And another technique that we talked about last time that can really help you stay focused and engaged is note-taking.
Yeah, I was actually already thinking about that because I take notes all the time when I'm listening to podcasts in my own language.
It's a great habit to have. And it's just as helpful for language learning. You can write down new words you hear, or you can summarize the main points of the podcast, or even just jot down any thoughts or questions that come up while you're listening.
Yeah, I like that. It makes me feel like I'm really interacting with the podcast instead of just passively absorbing it.
Exactly. And it can also help you remember what you've learned.
Okay, so I'm definitely going to try that too. Are there any other tips for note-taking? Like, is there a right way or a wrong way to do it?
Honestly, there's not really a right or wrong way. It's
Yeah.
really whatever works best for you. Some people like to write down every single detail, while others prefer to just jot down the key takeaways.
So it's more about the process of thinking about what you're hearing and trying to capture it in some way.
Exactly. And you can always experiment with different styles of note-taking until you find one that you like.
Okay, cool. So we've talked about listening without a transcript, and we've talked about note-taking. You also mentioned something called shadowing last time. Can you remind me what that is?
Yeah, shadowing is basically where you listen to the podcast and you try to repeat what the speaker is saying at the same time.
Oh, right. So it's like I'm their shadow.
Exactly. You're trying to mimic their pronunciation, their intonation, even their pace, if you can.
Wow, okay. That sounds challenging. But I can see how it would be really good for pronunciation.
It is. And it can also help with fluency because you're training your mouth to make the sounds of English more naturally.
So it's kind of like a workout for my tongue.
Exactly. And you can even record yourself while you're shadowing and then listen back to it and compare yourself to the original speaker.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Then I can really hear where I need to improve.
Right. You can pinpoint specific sounds that you're having trouble with, or maybe you'll notice that you tend to speak too slowly or too quickly.
Okay, I'm definitely adding shadowing to my list of things to try. So I'm getting the sense that there's a kind of a hierarchy of active listening techniques. Like some are more basic and some are more advanced.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And, the most advanced technique that we've talked about is transcribing.
Right, where you write down every single word of the podcast.
Exactly. And that's a really tough one. I'm not going to lie. It's like the ultimate listening challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's probably something I should work up to.
Definitely. It's not something you need to be able to do right away, but it's a good goal to have. As you get more comfortable with the other techniques, you can start to challenge yourself with transcribing.
Okay, so transcribing is like the final boss of active listening.
Exactly. But even if you never get to the point where you can transcribe a whole podcast episode, that's okay. The important thing is to find the techniques that work for you and to use them consistently.
Right. It's like any skill, the more you practice, the better you'll get.
Exactly. And one thing that can really help with consistency is finding a community of other learners.
Oh, yeah, we talked about that a little bit last time. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, there are tons of online communities for people learning English with podcasts.
What kinds of things do people do in those communities?
Oh, all sorts of things. They share their favorite podcasts, they give each other tips and advice. They even sometimes organize listening challenges or study groups.
That's cool. So like having a support system.
Exactly. Because learning a language can be tough, and it's definitely easier when you don't feel like you're doing it alone.
Totally. I'm actually feeling a lot more motivated now than I was at the beginning of this conversation. Like it all seems much more manageable now that we've broken it down.
That's awesome. That's what we like to hear.
So I'm ready to dive in. I'm going to find some podcasts I'm interested in. I'm going to try out all these techniques. I'm going to find a community of learners to connect with. But before we move on, any other words of wisdom?
I think the most important thing is to remember that it's supposed to be fun. You're learning a new language that's exciting. So choose podcasts that you're genuinely interested in, and don't be afraid to experiment with different techniques until you find what works best for you. And if you're enjoying the process, you'll be much more likely to stick with it.
That's great advice. And I think that's a perfect note to end on for this part of our conversation. But don't worry, we'll be back soon with even more tips and strategies to help you improve your English listening skills with podcasts. Okay, so we're back, and we've been talking about using podcasts to improve your English listening skills.
And we've covered a lot of ground, how to choose the right podcast, how to listen actively, all those different techniques.
Right, and I think we've given people a lot to think about and a lot to try out.
Yeah.
But one thing that I'm always thinking about when I'm trying to learn something new is how do I actually make it stick?
That's a great point. It's easy to get excited about a new learning method or a new resource, but then life gets in the way and you kind of forget about it.
Yeah, that happens to me all the time.
Right. So the key is to make it a habit, to make it something that you do automatically without even thinking about it.
Okay, so how do we do that? Like, how do we turn podcast listening into a habit?
Well, think about something that you already do every day without fail, like brushing your teeth.
Okay, yeah, I brush my teeth every day.
Right. You don't have to put it on your to-do list or set a reminder. You just do it because it's part of your routine.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's the same idea with podcast listening. You want to find a way to make it part of your daily or weekly routine.
Okay, so I should be like scheduling podcast listening time into my calendar.
You could definitely do that. Or you could just try to associate it with another activity that you already do regularly. Like maybe you listen to a podcast while you're getting ready in the morning or while you're commuting to work or school.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. I always listen to music on my commute.
Yeah.
Maybe I could swap that out for a podcast a couple times a week.
Exactly. Or maybe you listen to a podcast while you're cooking dinner or while you're doing chores around the house.
Okay, so the key is to find a time that works for me and then just make it a regular thing.
Exactly. And, it doesn't have to be a huge time commitment. Even just 15 or 20 minutes a day can make a big difference.
Okay, that's good to know. Because I was thinking like, oh man, am I going to have to listen to podcasts for like an hour every day?
No, not at all. Just start small and be consistent. And as you get more comfortable and you start to see progress, you can always increase the amount of time you spend listening.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So consistency is key. But you know what? One thing that I struggle with is staying motivated. Like sometimes I'll be really gung-ho about something for a while, and then I just kind of lose interest.
Yeah, I think that happens to everyone. And it's especially common with language learning because it can be a long and challenging process.
Right. So how do we stay motivated? Like how do we keep ourselves from giving up?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to choose podcasts that you're genuinely interested in. If
Yeah.
you're listening to something that you find boring or irrelevant, you're not going to want to keep doing it.
Yeah, that's true. I'm much more likely to stick with a podcast if it's about something I'm actually curious about.
Exactly. So think about your hobbies, your interests, your passions, and find podcasts that align with those things.
Okay, so I'm not just listening to podcasts to learn English. I'm listening to podcasts that I would enjoy anyway.
Exactly. And that way, even if you're not actively thinking about the language learning aspect, you're still getting exposure to English and you're still improving your listening skills.
Okay, that's a good mindset to have.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what else I think is important is to not be afraid to experiment.
Definitely. We've talked about a lot of different active listening techniques, but there's no one right way to do it. What works for one person might not work for another.
Right. So we should be trying things out, seeing what we like and what helps us learn the best.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to mix things up, you know? Maybe one week you focus on note-taking and the next week you try shadowing. And, it's also okay to just listen passively sometimes if that's what you feel like doing.
Right. It's all about finding what works for you and what keeps you engaged.
Exactly. And, another thing that I think is really helpful for staying motivated is to remember that it's a process. You're not going to become fluent overnight. It takes time and it takes effort.
Yeah, that's something I have to remind myself of all the time.
But the important thing is to celebrate the small victories. Every time you understand a new word or you're able to follow a conversation, that's a big deal.
Yeah, that's true. It's easy to get caught up in what we still don't know, but we should also be proud of how far we've come.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are millions of people all over the world learning English, and there are so many resources and communities out there to support you.
That's a really good point.
Yeah,
And speaking of communities, I think that's something we should emphasize a bit more. Last time we talked about how helpful it could be to connect with other English learners.
definitely. It's so motivating to be able to share your experiences with other people who are going through the same thing.
Right. And you can learn so much from each other.
Yeah.
You can get tips and advice, and you can also just encourage each other and celebrate each other's successes.
Exactly. And, there are tons of online communities out there specifically for people learning English with podcasts.
Really? That's cool. Where can people find those?
You can find them on social media platforms like Facebook and Reddit, and there are also websites and forums dedicated to language learning.
Okay, so if you're feeling lost or alone, or you just want to connect with other learners, definitely check out those online communities.
Definitely. And, I think that's a really great message to end on. The idea that you're not alone in this journey and that there are people out there who want to help you succeed.
Yeah, and that learning English can be fun and rewarding, and that podcasts are a fantastic tool to help you along the way.
Exactly. So to everyone out there who's listening and who's trying to improve their English skills, keep up the great work. You've got this.
And keep listening to those podcasts. And on that note, I think we're going to wrap things up for today. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into using podcasts to improve your English listening skills.
And we'll be back soon with more tips and strategies to help you on your language learning journey.
Until then, happy listening, everyone.